Madagascar's Gen Z Uprising, a crisis of light, water, and legitimacy. Welcome to The Bold African Voice, BAV, where we go beyond the headlines to uncover the stories shaping Africa's future. I'm Zainab Karoma. Today, we turn to Madagascar, where deadly Gen Z-led protests have shaken the nation, forcing President Andry Rajoelina to dissolve his government. But is this just a change of faces or the beginning of deeper transformation? Let's break it down. The immediate drama: power cuts, water shortages, youth rage. In late September 2025, Madagascar found itself convulsed by protests led largely by young people, demanding something that many take for granted elsewhere: stable electricity, clean water, dignity in daily living. The demonstrations, broadly labeled the Gen Z movement, erupted in the capital Antananarivo and spread to other cities. They were triggered by repeated outages in power and water services, but the grievances ran deeper: systemic poverty, weak governance, and a sense that young people's sufferings have long been ignored. According to the United Nations, at least 22 people died in clashes, both from security force responses and from looting or violence by criminal elements during the unrest. Well over 100 were injured. AP News +1. The government disputes the UN's casualty figures and has not published its own tallies. President Andry Rajoelina responded by dissolving the government, sacking Prime Minister Christian Ntse while keeping him and ministers in place in an interim capacity, and promising a short window to propose a new leader. He also apologized somewhat for failures by parts of his government and removed the energy minister earlier in the week. Nonetheless, the protests did not immediately subside. On September 30th, demonstrators returned to the streets, defying curfews, and security forces fired tear gas. The unrest extended beyond Antananarivo to cities such as Fenoarivo, Mahajanga, and Diego Suarez, Antsiranana. A curfew had been imposed earlier, from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m., in an attempt to restore order. During the unrest, looting and destruction occurred. A major shopping mall was burned. Politicians' homes were targeted. Infrastructure, including cable car stations, was vandalized. One symbolic twist: protesters adopted a stylized pirate flag emblem derived from the Japanese anime One Piece, often the straw hat Jolly Roger, as their movement symbol. That same logo has appeared in youth protests in Nepal, Indonesia, and even France, a kind of shared meme of youthful revolt. Signs at marches read slogans such as, "We want to live, not survive." The protests were largely decentralized, operating through social media and without clear central leadership. Madagascar is among the world's poorest countries. In 2022, approximately 3/4 of its 30 million people live below the poverty line. Only about 36% of the population has access to electricity, and that access is often erratic and unreliable. The national utility, Jirama, normally posts planned outage schedules on Facebook, but on the day the protests erupted, it suspended its posting for 36 days, including new posts and comments. Thus, this is not just a revolt about missing hours of electricity or water. It is a revolt over the sense that the infrastructure and governance that underpin everyday life have failed the Malagasy people, especially its youth. Critical analysis: why this upsurge, and is it sustainable? Structural fragility meets youth impatience. On paper, the triggers, power and water cuts, seem mundane, but precisely because these services are so fundamental, their absence becomes intolerable, especially in places lacking robust safety nets. The protest underscores the limits of symbolic or cosmetic reforms in societies where basic systems are broken. Rajoelina's dissolution of his government is a classic political reset. But critics will note, changing ministers without changing the underlying system is like rearranging the deck chairs while the ship has a gaping hole breach. In other words, the real challenge is institutional reform, energy sector overhaul, regulatory transparency, accountability mechanisms, infrastructure investment, and decoupling public utilities from patronage networks. The risk is that a new government will look different on the surface, but pursue much the same policies. Because the protests are decentralized and leaderless, they gain moral and tactical flexibility. Harder for the regime to decapitate them by arresting a few people. but they also risk fragmentation, co-optation, or drift without strategy. Will the Gen Z movement evolve the capacity for negotiated politics, e.g., a credible list of demands, interlocutors, accountability, or remain episodic street action? Another challenge, violence and looting. Even movements rooted in legitimate grievance become vulnerable when fringe elements exploit the chaos. The presence of looters and attacks on property weakens popular sympathy and gives the state ammunition to crack down. In Madagascar's case, some of the casualties were not due to security forces, but violent actors unconnected to the demonstrators. There is also the question of legitimacy and continuity. Rajoelina has long held a strong grip on Malagasy politics. He first came to power via a provisional government after a coup in 2009 and has been a political fixture ever since. In 2023, he won re-election in a contest boycotted by opposition candidates. Many see his rule as authoritarian, or at least semi-authoritarian. Thus, the question is whether this moment signals a tipping point, or a temporary rupture that the regime can absorb, contagion, cross-fertilization, and regional echoes. What's remarkable is how deeply these protests resonate with contemporaneous youth movements across Africa and beyond. The idea that a Gen Z revolt in Madagascar imports symbols or tactics is not absurd when you see the same pirate flag in Nepal, Indonesia, and now multiple African countries. In Kenya in 2024 and 2025, protests led by younger citizens opposed tax hikes, austerity, and political exclusion. Those movements were sometimes called Gen Z protests. In 2025, protests in Kenya extended further following the death of blogger Albert Ojwang in police custody. The movement confronted state violence and has produced more sustained youth activism. In Morocco, in late September 2025, youth groups under a Gen Z 212 banner protested government priorities, escalating spending on stadiums and global mega events rather than on health, education, and basic services. We can view this moment as part of a broader African pattern, a youth generation that is more connected via social media, more literate in comparative models, more impatient for accountability, and less deferential to old notions of stability at all costs. Analysts have posited that we may be seeing the early cold embers of an African spring, though that metaphor is overworked and simplistic. Yet there are caveats. Each country has distinct political legacies, state capacities, and class structures. A Gen Z protest in Madagascar over power cuts is structurally different from protests about police violence in Nigeria or political exclusion in Uganda. Also, many of these youth protests are nascent. They have yet to build formal structures, cross-class coalitions, or credible political vehicles. Still, the possibility of cross-contagion is real. Protesters in Madagascar invoke the same symbols. Observers in Kenya watch. Even regimes may learn. Some might try to preempt youth demands by incremental reforms, others might crack down, but the space of political legitimacy is undeniably shifting. Risks, bottlenecks, and the youth dividend question, for all their moral urgency, youth uprisings face structural constraints. Scaling, turning protest energy into sustained policy influence is hard. State elites have control over coercive instruments, media, patronage, and institutions. If protests recede, the system reasserts itself. The regime may respond with repression, co-optation, or performative reforms. A new cabinet may contain technocrats, but without structural change in public utilities or governance, the same crises will recur. Worse, symbolic concessions without accountability can deepen cynicism. Another risk is that protests get captured by more traditional opposition forces or populist actors, losing their identity or devolving into partisan struggles. The youth voice might become subsumed in older power games. Also, infrastructure deficits are not solved overnight. Power grid upgrades, water distribution systems, fiscal reforms, these require capital, planning, technical capacity, and years of effort. The temptation for quick shortcuts, e.g. privatization, debt, external loans, brings its own perils. Finally, there's the demographic paradox. Africa has the youngest population globally. Many governments have long bet on the youth dividend, that a burgeoning youthful workforce can fuel growth. But if those youth see no opportunity, no fairness, and no voice, the dividend becomes a discontent bomb. Africa-wide comparisons, light and water, but also voice. Let's compare Madagascar's uprising to a few emblematic African protest moments to highlight similarities, differences, and lessons. Kenya, 2024 to 2025. Tax protests, police violence, digital mobilization. Kenya's Gen Z protests began over proposed tax increases on goods like diapers, bread, and sanitary items, and further escalated after the death of Albert Ojwang in police custody, a blogger arrested for social media speech. The protests exposed deep frustrations over inequality, exclusion, and state violence. In Kenya, the protests were not just about utilities, but also about economic policy, freedom of expression, corruption, and political reform. The youth leveraged social media, satire, mobilizing networks, and low-budget tactics, memes, flash mobs, decentralized gatherings. Many protests were met with brutal police responses and dozens of deaths. Compared to Madagascar, Kenya's protests had a somewhat stronger pretext in macroeconomic policy and explicit governance demands. But like Madagascar, the movement was decentralized, youth-led, and challenged the ruling elite's legitimacy. Some Kenyan analysts believe these protests may push for formal channels, youth inclusion in politics, better policing, accountability. Morocco, 2025. Stadiums versus hospitals, youth frustration. In Morocco, the Gen Z 212 protests erupted in late September 2025. As youth criticized the government's heavy spending on stadiums and preparations for the 2030 FIFA World Cup, while healthcare and education systems languished. One trigger was the death of 8 women during childbirth in a public hospital, a stark symbol of health system collapse. While the Moroccan protests are less immediately about utilities, structurally they are similar. Youth rejecting the prioritization of prestige projects over basic welfare, demanding accountability, and rejecting deference. The use of decentralized collectives rather than party structures echoes what's happening in Madagascar. In contrast, Morocco's state is stronger, with greater capacity and stability. That may limit the extent of disruption, but also make the protest stakes higher. The movement's success depends on pushing the state to reorient spending, not collapse it. Senegal, 2023 to 2024. Protests over political exclusion. Senegal's 2023 to 2024 unrest centered not on utilities, but on the conviction of opposition leader Ousmane Sonko, potentially disqualifying him from elections. Youth protests raged in Dakar and beyond, leading to at least 23 deaths and hundreds arrested. That movement demonstrates how youth activism may target political constraints, the limits of opposition, legal manipulation, and electoral hijinks. While Madagascar's protests are more infrastructural, both touch on deeper issues: who governs, under what rules, and to what ends. Mali, 2025. Military rule challenged. In Mali, 2025 protests erupted in Bamako and elsewhere against the military junta led by Assimi Goïta, especially over moves to extend presidential term and dissolve political parties. Though different in context, a military regime rather than semi-democratic state, Mali's protests show how populist momentum can rise even under severe repression. The youth, civil society, and institutional actors attempted to push back, though the outcome remains uncertain. Angola, 2025. Fuel subsidy hikes and economic stress. Angola's protests in July 2025 were triggered by the removal of fuel subsidies and resultant steep increases in energy prices, especially affecting transport and low-income populations. Youth joined strikes, marches, and riots clashing with security forces. Reports cited around 22 deaths and over 1,200 arrests. There's a symmetry here. Energy fuel is to Angola what electricity is to Madagascar. When subsidies fall or services break, the cost falls on people. Like Madagascar, the protests were the product of structural inequality. Despite being resource-rich, Angola has deep poverty beneath an oil economy. Forward-looking, scenarios, stakes, and what might come next, what might happen in Madagascar, and what lessons should the region heed? Possible trajectories for Madagascar. 1. Managed reform. Rajoelina appoints a technocratic government, offers modest reforms, some subsidy relief, infrastructure projects, better contracts with energy firms, and attempts to placate youth without altering power structures. The protests subside, but the structural problems linger. 2. Escalation and compromise. Protesters press harder, demanding not just ministerial changes, but constitutional reform, oversight bodies, or even presidential resignation. The regime responds with partial concessions, possibly power sharing, or even a transitional government. 3. Repression and rollback. The state reasserts control forcefully, imposing stricter curfews, suspending civil liberties, and arresting organizers. The movement is pushed underground or fractured. This risks more bloodshed and long-term alienation of youth. 4. Institutional transformation. If the energy/water sectors are reformed with transparency, investment, accountability, and youth are integrated into governance, commissions, civic councils, local oversight, Madagascar could emerge with re-legitimized state capacity. This is the riskiest path, but also the most hopeful. What will determine which path prevails? Elites' appetite for real change. Are ruling elites willing to cede control of patronage networks, contracts, and state enterprises? Youth durability and leadership. Can the protest movement evolve beyond the streets into structured, credible interlocutors? External actors' role. International donors, infrastructure investors, regional bodies, and NGOs might push or pull the balance. Financial conditionalities, monitoring, technical assistance. Media and communication space. The ability of youth to mobilize, document, and narrate the struggle is central. If the regime clamps down on social media, blocks platforms, or restricts speech, it changes the dynamic. State coercive capacity. If security forces crack down severely and with impunity, that can stifle dissent temporarily, but at long-term cost of legitimacy and trust. If Madagascar fails to seize this moment, it risks further instability, deeper disillusionment among youth, and possibly cycles of revolt every few years. But if it can channel the energy into institutional reform, it could become a model, albeit difficult, for subtle transitions in similar African states, lessons for Africa and global youth. Protests are not a policy toolbox. Energy systems, utility governance, infrastructure, regulatory reform, and public sector capacity must follow, or the protests lose steam. Youth energy must translate to institutions. Movements without structure struggle to bargain. Building bridges to NGOs, civil society, local governments, and even reformist elites is critical. Decentralized resistance is both strength and weakness. It resists capture, but often lacks coherence or sustainability. Symbolism matters. The adoption of the pirate flag meme, or the slogan, "We want to live, not survive," shows how youth movements now traffic in global symbolism. That helps connect movements across borders, but it can also invite caricature or backlash. Repression is not a deterrent, only a risk. Many governments learn that heavy response may suppress for a moment, but anger festers. Overuse of force erodes legitimacy. Preemption is better than reaction. Governments that anticipate youth demands through consultative councils, youth budgets, infrastructural planning may avoid this kind of rupture. Latest developments as of September 30th, 2025. Protesters returned to the streets despite the dissolution of government, demonstrating that symbolic gestures may not suffice. Security forces used tear gas against hundreds of young demonstrators in multiple cities. Protesters demanded further concessions, including an apology, dismissal of Antananarivo's city administrator, and broader structural changes. The opposition foreign ministry criticized the state's refusal to accept UN figures on casualties and called for more accountability. Meanwhile, in Morocco, youth under the banner Gen Z 212 escalated protests over government spending priorities and deteriorating healthcare, a regional echo of the broader youth discontent. These developments suggest that Madagascar's moment is still unresolved. The dynamic tension between youth mobilization and state response continues. Beyond Madagascar, a youth quake across Africa. It would be a mistake to treat the Malagasy protests as an isolated island event, pun fully intended. From Nairobi to Rabat, Dakar to Luanda, Gen Z is rewriting the political playbook with hashtags, anime flags, and unapologetic demands for a future worth living in. The Kenyan connection. In Kenya, Gen Z has become a synonym for defiance. What started as protests against taxation of bread and sanitary pads escalated into a generational pushback against corruption and police brutality. If you think this is trivial, imagine telling your grandmother that you were tear-gassed while defending the sanctity of affordable sanitary pads. It sounds absurd, but it underscores the seriousness of what youth consider non-negotiable in 2025. Kenya's lesson for Madagascar: youth movements can survive beyond the first wave if they keep innovating. Memes, satire, and decentralized swarm tactics that outmaneuver rigid state structures. But they must also guard against fatigue. After all, you can't meme your way to a reliable electricity grid, Morocco's stadium dilemma. Meanwhile, Moroccan youth marched under the Gen Z 212 banner to denounce lavish state spending on football stadiums while hospitals collapse. One young protester put it bluntly, "We can't deliver babies on grass pitches, a line so sharp it should be trademarked." The Moroccan comparison highlights a broader African contradiction. Governments chase prestige projects, stadiums, summits, skyscrapers, while youth demand functional basics like healthcare, water, and lights that stay on past halftime. Senegal's Sonko moment. In Senegal, youth mobilized around opposition leader Ousmane Sonko's exclusion from politics. While Madagascar's protests are about infrastructure failures, Senegal's centered on political exclusion. The common denominator? Young people refusing to accept business as usual from political elites. Angola's fuel fiasco. Angola's July 2025 protests over fuel subsidy removals killed more than 20 people and saw over 1,000 arrests. That's another reminder. When governance squeezes youth in their daily survival, whether through electricity bills or petrol pumps, the streets become the default parliament. Humor in hardship. We want to live, not survive. Madagascar's protesters brandish slogans like, "We want to live, not survive." It's catchy, tragic, and true. But here's the satirical twist. African leaders often reply with the political equivalent of, "Have you tried turning the country off and on again?" President Rajoelina dissolved the government as though rebooting the political operating system would suddenly fix the power grid. If governance were a laptop, the youth might ask, "Sir, have you considered installing an update instead of just pressing restart?" Forward-looking scenarios, Africa's next moves. 1. Institutional upgrades, not cabinet shuffle. Madagascar must learn that swapping ministers is not equivalent to fixing transformers. Genuine investment in infrastructure, anti-corruption measures, and transparency is required. 2. Youth integration into governance. From Kenya's hashtags to Madagascar's pirate flags, young Africans are demanding a seat at the table. If leaders don't create youth councils, participatory budgeting, and digital engagement, the street will remain the only arena. Third regional domino effect. As seen in Morocco, Kenya, Senegal, and Angola, the Gen Z effect is continental. Africa's leaders ignore these signals at their peril. If anything, the next wave of protests could spread faster than WhatsApp forwards in a family group chat. 4. The risk of militarization. If regimes respond primarily with police and military, youth radicalization could follow. Africa has seen this movie before, and it doesn't end well. Why this matters globally. Climate and development aid. International donors can't talk green transitions in Madagascar if youth don't even have lights at home. Global symbols. The pirate flag from One Piece proves that pop culture is now global protest currency. What's next? African protesters rallying under the banner of Avengers Assemble. Don't laugh. It's possible. Democracy's test. Each protest tests whether African states can evolve through reform or relapse into cycles of repression. A continental crossroads. The soundtrack of discontent. The Malagasy protests are not merely about electricity. They are a warning siren across Africa, a continent where 70% of the population is under 30, yet where too many governments still act like youth are background extras in the drama of governance. This isn't a one-off. Kenya's tax resistance, Morocco's healthcare protests, Angola's fuel riots, Senegal's Sonko saga all point to the same refrain. Young Africans are no longer content to sit quietly in the corner while their futures are mortgaged to corruption, vanity projects, and broken utilities. And if anyone doubts this is generational, just look at the pirate flag borrowed from One Piece. It's globalized protest culture, an internet-driven solidarity that makes local anger part of a worldwide chorus. Gen Z isn't only confronting their presidents, they're sinking their grievances on TikTok, Twitter, X, and Instagram, where a hashtag can sometimes be more frightening to a minister than an opposition rally. The forward-looking lens. Will the African Spring 2.0 arrive? The question isn't whether youth protests will continue, they will. The question is whether governments will learn before the continent plunges into a cycle of permanent instability. The risks are obvious. Repression without reform breeds cycles of violence and radicalization. Symbolic gestures, cabinet reshuffles, apologies on TV, without real policy change, only deepen cynicism. Prestige projects, stadiums, flashy airports, unnecessary conferences may win applause abroad but spark fury at home when citizens can't afford bread or electricity. Neglecting digital spaces is perilous. Today's protests are organized online. Blocking Facebook posts, as Madagascar's utility Jarama did, only fans the flames. But there is also opportunity. Youth energy is not just destructive, it is creative. It can be harnessed into innovation hubs, local governance councils, environmental action, and democratic renewal. Governments that invite youth into decision-making can convert protesters into partners. A country that treats its young as assets, not adversaries, might yet unlock its long-promised youth dividend. A dash of humor, the African leader's survival kit. If African presidents want to avoid facing pirate flags in their capitals, here's a tongue-in-cheek starter pack. 1. Keep the lights on. No revolution ever started because Netflix was buffering, but power cuts have toppled governments. 2. Water before Wi-Fi. Free data plans are nice, but drinking water is non-negotiable. 3. Less stadium, more hospital. Winning the World Cup is great, but not if your citizens are collapsing on the way to the hospital. 4. Stop recycling the same ministers. Africans have grown tired of new government, same old faces. 5. Respect the hashtag, ignore it at your peril. Today's hashtags are tomorrow's headlines. Advice to African leaders. 1. Listen, don't lecture. Youth are tired of paternalistic speeches about patience and sacrifice. Engage them as stakeholders, not as children. 2. Prioritize basics over prestige. Roads, power, water, health, and education must come before mega projects. Development is not a photo op. 3. Institutionalize youth voice. Create youth advisory councils, participatory budgets, and policies co-designed with young people. 4. Strengthen institutions, not personalities. Leadership cults are brittle. Only strong, independent institutions can provide lasting stability. 5. Invest in transparency. Publish outage schedules, budget breakdowns, and reform plans openly. Citizens forgive hardship more easily when they see honesty. 6. Regional solidarity. Governments should not only fear youth protests, but also collaborate regionally to address them through shared best practices, not shared riot police. Key messages in summary. Madagascar's Gen Z protests are part of a wider African wave of youth-led uprisings demanding dignity, not survival. The unrest is fueled by chronic governance failures, unreliable utilities, poverty, corruption, and misplaced state priorities. Similar movements in Kenya, Morocco, Senegal, and Angola show that youth discontent is continental, digitally connected, and increasingly global in its symbols. Quick fixes like cabinet reshuffles cannot substitute for systemic reforms. African leaders face a choice: embrace youth as partners in governance or risk continuous waves of rebellion. The youth are not asking for miracles, just light, water, opportunity, and respect. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV, where Africa's stories are told with depth, courage, and clarity. What do you think? Are Madagascar's protests the start of a continental Gen Z wave? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And hit that notification bell so you never miss our critical analysis of Africa's unfolding stories. Together, we are shaping the narrative. Together, we are the Bold African Voice,